This is the deadliest hurricane that has ever existed, and when I tell you about all of the crazy things that happened because of it, you will understand why. On October 29th, 1893, the most powerful tropical cyclone ever recorded by modern instruments made landfall in the island nation of Puerto Rico. Since then, hurricanes have been ranked based on their wind speed at landfall, with Category 5 being the highest, reserved for the most violent storms. But this one had a trick up its sleeve that no other storm had ever deployed before. There was every indication that this would be an unusually active season in the Atlantic Basin. As early as August, several tropical storms had already formed, which was unusual at the time because the official start of hurricane season wasn't until June. But the weather scientists of the day were so sure that these storms were a sign of things to come that they named them anyway, giving us what today would be the names of two very familiar names, Florence and John. After Florence and Jane came more storms, including one particularly fierce tempest known as the Summaries, which hit the Lesser Antilles and moved into the Caribbean, where it eventually dissipated. But the ingredients were in place for something even bigger and worse to come. Hot waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean were mixing with cooler northern Atlantic waters in a way that experts said created conditions perfect for the rapid intensification of tropical cyclones. And then it happened. On September, just over a month after San Ciprian, a new tropical wave developed off the coast of Africa. It headed west, crossed the Atlantic, and on October merged with a front from the United States, bringing it over warm Caribbean waters where it exploded in intensity. Within 2 days, the storm had gone from a weak tropical depression to a Category 4 monster with 145-mile-per-hour winds. At its peak, the storm had a well-defined eye surrounded by an unbroken wall of clouds. Then the eye wall started to shrink, and the pressure in the center of the storm dropped dramatically. By the next day, it was a Category 5 with 160-mile-per-hour winds. At this point, the U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. realized they had a problem. There were 6 islands in the Greater Antilles, and not a single weather station among them. They sent an urgent message to naval and military bases in the region, asking for someone to go to Haiti or Cuba and get the latest weather report on the storm. Unfortunately, it was Sunday and most of the offices were closed, so nobody got the memo until Monday morning, when the storm was only 24 hours away. The first and only warning they received was a telegraph sent from the French Meteorological Service reading hurricane observed by the steamer Captain Renault, latitude 20 degrees, longitude 74 degrees. It was too little, too late. At around 5 p.m. on October, the storm made landfall in western Puerto Rico near the city of Cabo Rojo with terrifying force. Houses were leveled, entire sugar plantations were wiped off the map, and by some accounts, giant water spouts descended from the sky, sucking people right out of their homes. Luckily, there was a U.S. Army Signal Corps detachment at Camp Columbia in Puerto Rico who managed to send a report back to Washington, D.C. of the catastrophic damage at Cabo Rojo, but it was too late to sound the alarm there as well. No warnings went out until after the storm passed. It was only after the eye of the storm passed over the island that people in Puerto Rico began to realize the true scope of the disaster. Coastal towns were completely destroyed, and inland areas were inundated with The storm surge, which is the rise in sea level caused by the force of the wind, was estimated at a staggering 40 feet. Many of the people who survived the initial impact of the storm were now struggling to survive the that have covered their homes and swept away their food and supplies. As if this wasn't bad enough, the storm surge also pushed saltwater miles inland, contaminating freshwater sources and killing off crops. With communications down and aid unable to reach survivors, in the immediate aftermath of the storm, people were forced to rely on their neighbors and the charity of strangers for food and water. Doctors set up emergency clinics in the ruins of hospitals to treat those who had lost limbs or suffered severe injuries. Thousands of bodies littered the streets of the hardest hit areas. But since most of the cemeteries were full or had been destroyed by the storm, many bodies were left unburied. People in the area reported cases of looting, and people even had to flee inland to escape the bands of robbers. The few ships that were able to reach the island found that people were too afraid to board them, for fear of being taken off the island and abandoned in the flooded wreckage. In the end, 2,270 people are believed to have died as a result of the storm in Puerto Rico. Nearly half of the entire population of the island. The army worked tirelessly to restore order, and aid began to arrive from other parts of the United States. Still, there was no accounting for the thousands of people who disappeared in the storm, most of them never heard from again. But that wasn't the end of the story. See, after hitting Puerto Rico, the storm took a weird turn. Normally, once a tropical cyclone makes landfall, It follows a predictable path. It either makes a second landfall elsewhere or it weakens and meanders around in the ocean for a while before finally dissipating. This one did neither. Instead, after crossing Puerto Rico, the storm practically vanished from existence for a whole day. Then on October, almost 24 hours after making landfall in Puerto Rico, it was spotted again just north of the Bahamas, alive and well, and it was growing stronger by the minute. It headed toward Florida, passing dangerously close to the heavily populated areas of Miami and Daytona Beach. Fortunately, the storm's path shifted just enough to spare these cities the worst of its wrath. When the storm reached Florida, it wasn't quite as strong as when it hit Puerto Rico, but it was still a major hurricane. Here, too, the damage was catastrophic. Entire communities along the coast were leveled. Homes that were washed away were ripped apart by what locals described as 100-mile-an-hour waves. In total, the storm caused $9 million in damages in Florida alone, which was a lot of money at the time, especially considering that the entire U.S. economy was worth around $34 billion. The storm continued on a northerly track through Georgia and South Carolina, though it was much weaker at this point and didn't cause any significant damage until it hit North Carolina, where it made landfall again on October, this time near the Outer Banks. Once again, the wind and rain were relentless. For 12 hours, waves crashed over the sand dunes, flooding the low-lying areas and tearing apart the small wooden houses that dotted the coastline. The storm surge was so powerful that entire piers were torn from the foundations they had been built on. The storm continued inland, dumping torrential rains and causing widespread flooding in Virginia and West Virginia, before finally heading out to sea where it dissipated on November. In total, the Great Hurricane of 1893 claimed between 2,700 and 6,000 lives, making it the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States, and the deadliest hurricane in world history. It was responsible for 3.6% of all deaths in Puerto Rico in 1893, which is equivalent to losing 130,000 people in a year in the United States. If such a storm were to strike today, the death toll could easily reach into the hundreds of thousands. All of this destruction and death raises the question, why didn't they see it coming? Back then, weather forecasting was a relatively new field, and the technology for tracking storms was rudimentary at best. There was no such thing as a weather satellite, and the only way to get a weather report was to literally send someone out to sea to take a reading. Even once the storm was on its way, there was no way to know how strong it would be when it hit land. The closest thing they had to modern forecasting technology was a device called a barograph, which is basically a fancy barometer that records air pressure over time. By plotting the pressure readings, meteorologists could get a general idea of the storm's track, but that was about it. Today, we have sophisticated weather models that can predict the path of a hurricane days in advance. We can track their intensity as they form and even measure the changes in air pressure and wind speed in real time. All of this gives us an unprecedented ability to forecast the behavior of storms and warn people in the path of danger well in advance. Could we ever see another storm like the Great Hurricane of 1893? Probably not. Storms are ranked based on their Saffir-Simpson scale, which takes into account the intensity of the winds and the storm surge that they produce. A Category 5 storm like the one that devastated Puerto Rico and Florida produces a storm surge of 15 to 25 feet. The Great Hurricane of 1893 produced a storm surge of 40 feet. While it is possible for a storm to produce a storm surge higher than the ones currently ranked on the Saffir-Simpson scale, it's highly unlikely. And thank goodness for that.